Let me begin by saying that the names in this story, Daniel, Evelyn, Clara, and others, are not the real names of those involved. They've been changed, chosen at random, to make the story easier to follow and to protect the identities of those who lived through this ordeal. But make no mistake, what I'm about to share is true, passed down to me by a fellow priest who faced this darkness head on. It's a story that unfolded in 1989 in the small town of Baraboo, Wisconsin, a place once known as the circus capital of the world because of its deep ties to the Ringling Brothers Circus. I wasn't there myself, but when I heard this account, it struck me as a chilling reminder of the reality of evil, a reality I've encountered many times in my own work as an exorcist. I don't come here to talk about myself. Those who know me know I'm a priest of the Archdiocese of Indianapolis, appointed in 2005 to serve as an exorcist, trained in Rome under the guidance of seasoned exorcists like Father Carmine de Philippus. My work is not about fame or spectacle. It's about standing in the gap between the human soul and the forces that seek to destroy it. This story, though, comes from a colleague in Baraboo, and it's one that has stayed with me, a testament to the power of faith and the terrifying cunning of the evil one. So, let's dive in, straight to the heart of what happened in that abandoned circus tent, where the ordinary met the extraordinary, and where the battle for a man's soul began. Picture Baraboo, a quiet town nestled in the rolling hills of Wisconsin, about 40 miles northwest of Madison. It's a place where the past lingers, where the legacy of the circus still casts a long shadow. Back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Baraboo was alive with the sights and sounds of the Ringling Brothers, clowns, acrobats, lion tamers, and the roar of the crowd under the big top. But by 1989, those glory days were long gone. The circus had moved on, and all that remained was a decaying relic, an old circus tent, sagging and forgotten on the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusted metal. It was a place most folks avoided, not because of any clear danger, but because it felt wrong. Like the air around it carried a weight, a heaviness that made your skin prickle. This is where our story begins, with a man named Daniel, a 42-year-old watchmaker who lived in a modest house about a quarter mile from that old tent. Daniel was a solitary figure, a man who kept to himself, tinkering with gears and springs in his small workshop. He was a Catholic, but not a fervent one, someone who'd maybe show up to Mass on Easter or Christmas, but whose faith had grown dusty, like the forgotten relics in that circus tent. Every day, Daniel would walk to town to pick up supplies, and his route took him right past the old tent. It was just part of the landscape for him, nothing special, until one late afternoon in the fall of 1989. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the fields, when Daniel noticed something strange. A flock of white doves had gathered on the roof of the tent, their cooing filling the air like a distorted hymn. Now, doves aren't uncommon in Wisconsin, but these were different. Their eyes glinted an unnatural yellow in the fading light, and they seemed to watch Daniel as he approached, their heads turning in unison. I've heard many stories in my years as an exorcist, and I can tell you that animals often sense what we cannot. Those doves weren't just birds. They were a sign, a warning of something stirring in that tent. Curiosity got the better of Daniel. He stepped inside the tent, pushing aside a tattered flap. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and the light barely filtered through the torn canvas. In the center of the tent, half buried in dust, was an old circus cage, the kind once used for animals like lions or bears. Inside the cage was a piece of cloth, a shroud, really folded neatly, as if someone had left it there intentionally. Daniel reached in and pulled it out, and as he did, he saw something that made his breath catch. Emblazoned on the cloth, in what looked like dried blood, was a single word, Moloch. Now, for those who know their scripture, that name carries weight. Moloch is no ordinary figure. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 18, verse 21, we're warned against offering sacrifices to Moloch, a pagan deity associated with fire and child sacrifice, often depicted with the head of a bull. In my studies as an exorcist, I've learned that Moloch is more than a myth. It's a demonic entity, one that preys on human desires for power, fame, or immortality. When Daniel touched that shroud, he felt a chill, like ice running through his veins. He didn't know it then, but he'd opened a door, and something ancient and malevolent had taken notice. That night, Daniel's life began to change. He started having dreams, vivid, terrifying dreams of a towering figure with the head of a bull, standing in a ring of fire. The figure spoke to him, its voice low and guttural, promising eternal life if Daniel would offer himself to it. These weren't just nightmares, they were assaults on his soul. Daniel woke up sweating, his heart pounding, unable to shake the image of those burning eyes. Over the next few days, he became obsessed. He started carving strange symbols, crude images of a bull's head into his workbench, his tools, even the wooden floor of his workshop. His neighbors noticed him growing distant, his eyes hollow, his voice strange. One neighbor, a retired elementary school teacher named Evelyn, was particularly concerned. Evelyn was a devout Catholic, the kind of woman who never missed Sunday Mass and always had a rosary in her pocket. She'd known Daniel for years, and she could tell something was wrong. One evening, she overheard him muttering to himself in his yard, words that sounded like gibberish but carried a rhythm, almost like a chant. Later, a scholar would identify those words as Akkadian, an ancient language from Mesopotamia, one Daniel had no way of knowing. Evelyn's heart sank. She'd read enough about spiritual warfare to recognize the signs of something far beyond ordinary human struggle. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She contacted Father Edward Sullivan, the pastor of Street Joseph's Church in Baraboo, a man known for his quiet strength and deep faith. Father Sullivan had no formal training as an exorcist, but he'd studied the rites and knew the signs of demonic influence. When Evelyn told him about Daniel, about the doves, the shroud, the strange behavior, he agreed to visit. What he found would set the stage for a battle that would test the faith of everyone involved. I've seen this pattern before in my own work. The devil doesn't just attack randomly, he chooses his targets carefully, exploiting loneliness, doubt, or unfulfilled desires. Daniel, with his quiet life and unspoken longing to be remembered, was an easy mark for Moloch. That shroud in the tent wasn't just a piece of cloth, it was a conduit, a bridge between our world and something far darker. And as Father Sullivan prepared to confront what was happening, he had no idea just how deep this evil ran, or how high the cost of fighting it would be. This is where the story begins to unfold, where the ordinary life of a small-town watchmaker collided with a force that's been manipulating humanity since the days of the Old Testament. In my years as an exorcist, I've learned that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it starts with something as simple as a flock of doves, a whisper in the dark, or a name written in blood. But make no mistake, when evil takes hold, it doesn't let go easily. And in Baraboo, in that forgotten circus tent, the battle was just beginning. Father Sullivan's first visit to Daniel's home was a moment of stark clarity. As he approached the small, weathered house just a quarter-mile from the old circus grounds, the air felt heavy, oppressive, like a storm waiting to break. Evelyn had warned him about Daniel's strange behavior, the muttered words in an unknown tongue, the bullhead carvings, the way his eyes seemed to look through you rather than at you. But nothing could have prepared Father Sullivan for what he saw that evening. Daniel stood in his backyard, a small patch of grass bordered by a sagging wooden fence, surrounded by a scattering of dead white doves. Their bodies were strewn across the ground, their yellow eyes still open, glinting in the twilight. It was as if they dropped from the sky mid-flight, their life snuffed out by something unseen. Daniel stood motionless, his lips moving, murmuring words that carried a cadence both foreign and profane. Father Sullivan, clutching his rosary, stepped forward and called out to Daniel. The man's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto the priest with an intensity that felt almost physical. "You cannot stop what's coming," Daniel said, his voice low and guttural, not his own. Father Sullivan recognized the signs immediately. In his years of ministry, he'd encountered troubled souls, but this was different. This was no mere mental distress. This was the presence of something demonic. He pulled a small vial of holy water from his pocket and began to sprinkle it, reciting the prayer to Street. "Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil." Daniel's reaction was immediate and violent. He let out a roar, a sound no human throat should make, and seized a heavy brass clock from a nearby table hurling it at Father Sullivan. The clock struck the priest's chest, knocking the wind out of him and leaving a deep bruise that would ache for weeks. Father Sullivan stumbled back but didn't retreat. He knew he was dealing with something far beyond his usual pastoral duties. He'd read about Moloch in his studies of scripture and demonology, a false god from the Old Testament, a demon that demanded sacrifice, often in the form of fire and blood. The name on that shroud was no coincidence. This was a calculated attack, and Daniel was its target. Father Sullivan returned to St. Joseph's that night, shaken but resolute. He contacted the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, requesting permission to perform a formal exorcism. The Church is careful about such things. Exorcisms aren't granted lightly, but Father Sullivan's detailed account of Daniel's behavior, the unnatural language, the physical aggression, the dead doves convinced the bishop that this was a case requiring immediate action. While Father Sullivan awaited approval, Evelyn took it upon herself to dig deeper. She wasn't just a concerned neighbor. She was a woman of action, driven by her faith and a fierce desire to protect those around her. She'd grown up hearing stories about Baraboo's circus days, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the old tent held secrets tied to Daniel's affliction. She reached out to Dr. Clara Bennett, a local historian and professor who'd spent years studying the Ringling brothers in the town's past. Clara was in her late 50s, a sharp-minded woman with a knack for uncovering forgotten truths. She agreed to meet Evelyn at the library, where they pored over old records, newspaper clippings, and dusty ledgers from the early 1900s. What Clara found sent chills down Evelyn's spine. In the 1920s, the circus tent hadn't just been a place of entertainment, it had been the site of a secret ritual. A group of performers, desperate for fame and immortality, had turned to occult practices, believing they could summon a power that would grant their wishes. They chose Moloch, drawn to the ancient stories of a deity who promised eternal glory in exchange for sacrifice. The ritual, held under the cover of night in that very tent, went horribly wrong. A fire broke out, unexplained and unstoppable, consuming part of the tent and claiming the lives of several performers. The official reports called it an accident, but whispers among the townsfolk spoke of screams that weren't human, of shadows moving in the flames. The shroud Daniel had found was no ordinary relic. It was a remnant of that failed ritual, a cursed object that served as a conduit for Moloch's influence. Clara and Evelyn decided to visit the tent themselves, hoping to find more clues. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and Evelyn's rosary, they stepped into the decaying structure. The air inside was stale, the canvas walls sagging like the skin of some ancient beast. Clara noticed faint burn marks on the wooden beams, remnants of that long-ago fire. As they explored, Evelyn found an old, leather-bound notebook tucked behind a broken crate. Its pages were brittle, being faded, but it contained handwritten accounts of the 1920 ritual. One entry, scrawled in a trembling hand, described the summoning of the bull-headed one and a warning, "The shroud must never be touched, for it binds him to this place." Evelyn's heart raced. She realized that Daniel's contact with the shroud had reawakened something that should have stayed buried. As they left the tent, Daniel appeared, as if drawn by some unseen force. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and his hands trembled. "You're meddling in things you don't understand," he hissed, his voice layered with something else, something ancient. Before Clara could react, Daniel lunged, a screwdriver clutched in his hand. He drove it into Clara's arm, the metal piercing deep and drawing blood. Clara screamed, collapsing as Evelyn pulled her away. They stumbled out of the tent, Clara clutching her wounded arm, and made it to Evelyn's car. At the hospital, doctors stitched up the wound, but Clara would need weeks to recover, and the trauma of that moment lingered. Evelyn, shaken but undeterred, returned to the tent alone the next day. She wasn't a historian or a priest, but she was a woman of faith, and she believed prayer could protect her. Inside, she found more evidence of the tent's dark past, a small, hidden compartment in the floor containing fragments of bone and ash, likely remnants of the ritual gone wrong. She also found a single page torn from an older text, possibly from the 1800s, describing a previous encounter with Moloch. A priest, unnamed in the account, had driven the demon out of a possessed circus performer, but not before the demon vowed to return through the relics of its temple. The shroud, Evelyn realized, was that relic. Back at Daniel's house, things were spiraling. He hadn't slept in days. His workshop now a chaotic mess of broken clocks and carved symbols. Neighbors reported hearing him shouting at night, words that sounded like curses in a language they couldn't place. One evening, Evelyn watched from her window as Daniel built a small fire in his backyard, the flames casting eerie shadows on his face. He held the shroud above the fire, chanting, "Moloch will grant me the eternal flame." Evelyn's heart sank. She knew this was no longer just about Daniel. It was about a force that wanted to claim more than one soul. Father Sullivan, now waiting for the Archdiocese's final approval, visited Evelyn to pray together. He brought with him a small crucifix and a vial of holy water, gifts from his own mentor during his seminary days. As they knelt in Evelyn's living room, reciting the litany of the saints, the temperature seemed to drop and the lights flickered. Evelyn clutched her rosary tighter, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. Father Sullivan spoke of the need for courage, reminding her that the devil thrives on fear and division. "We're not just fighting for Daniel," he said. "We're fighting for this town, for every soul that Moloch might try to touch. In my own work as an exorcist, I've seen how evil loves to isolate its victims, to make them feel alone and powerless. Daniel was a man who'd lived quietly, unnoticed by most, and that made him vulnerable. But Moloch's influence wasn't content to stay with him. It was spreading, testing the resolve of those around him, like Evelyn and Father Sullivan. As they prepared for what would come next, they had no idea how much they would be asked to sacrifice, or how fiercely the demon would fight to keep its hold. The circus tent, that forgotten relic of Baraboo's past, was no longer just a place. It was a battleground, and the war was only beginning. Father Sullivan knew that facing Moloch required more than his own resolve. After his initial encounter with Daniel, where he'd been struck by a hurled clock, he understood the gravity of the situation. The Archdiocese of Milwaukee was reviewing his request for a formal exorcism, but the process was slow, requiring careful discernment to ensure the case met the church's strict criteria. In the meantime, Father Sullivan sought support from a younger priest, Father Miguel Torres, who served at a neighboring parish. Father Torres was in his early 30s, a man of deep faith and quiet intensity, known for his compassion and willingness to face challenges head-on. When Father Sullivan explained the situation, Daniel's unnatural behavior, the dead doves, the name Moloch on the shroud, Father Torres didn't hesitate. "If this is the work of the devil," he said, "we'll face it together, with Christ as our shield." The two priests met at St. Joseph's Rectory to plan their next steps. The rectory, a modest brick building next to the church, became their temporary command center. Father Sullivan spread out maps of Baraboo, old photographs of the circus tent, and the notes Evelyn had shared from Clara's research. The tent, they concluded, was more than a relic of Baraboo's circus past. It was a focal point, a place where the veil between the natural and supernatural had been torn. The doves, with their eerie yellow eyes, seemed to guard it as if drawn by the same force that held Daniel captive. Father Sullivan proposed a bold plan. If the Archdiocese granted permission, they would perform the exorcism inside the tent itself, confronting Moloch on its own ground. Father Torres nodded, though his face betrayed a flicker of unease. He'd read about exorcisms, but had never witnessed one. Still, his trust in God and his mentor steadied him. While the priests prepared, Evelyn continued her own mission. Despite the fear that gripped her after Daniel's attack on Clara, her faith drove her to act. She visited Clara in the hospital, where the historian was recovering from the deep wound in her arm. Clara, though shaken, was determined to help. From her hospital bed, she shared more findings from her research, pieced together from old circus records and oral histories. She'd uncovered a chilling detail. The 1920 ritual wasn't the first time Moloch had been invoked in Baraboo. In the late 1800s, a traveling performer, a juggler with a reputation for dabbling in the occult, had fallen under a similar influence. He'd been found raving in the same tent, speaking in tongues and carving bullhead symbols into his own skin. A priest had intervened then, driving the demon out, but not before the performer took his own life in a fire that mirrored the later tragedy. Clara's voice trembled as she spoke. The tent isn't just a place, it's like a magnet drawing this thing back. Evelyn returned home, her mind racing. She spent hours in prayer, clutching her rosary and asking for strength. She also began to notice strange occurrences around her own house. Her kitchen clock, a gift from her late husband, stopped ticking at exactly 3 a.m, the hour often associated with demonic activity. Once, she woke to find her front door slightly ajar, though she was certain she'd locked it. The air in her home felt thick, as if something was watching her. She didn't tell Father Sullivan, not wanting to burden him, but she doubled her prayers, reciting the Memorare and the prayer to St. Joseph, the patron of her church. Evelyn wasn't a warrior in the traditional sense, but her faith made her formidable, a quiet force standing against the growing darkness. Meanwhile, Daniel's condition worsened. Neighbors reported seeing him wandering near the tent at night, barefoot and disheveled, muttering to himself. One woman, a baker who lived down the street, swore she saw the doves following him, their wings beating in unison like a heartbeat. Daniel's workshop, once a place of precision and order, was now a chaos of broken gears and splintered wood. He'd stopped taking clients, and his phone rang unanswered. Evelyn, checking on him from a distance, saw him sitting in his backyard staring at the shroud, which he'd pinned to a makeshift altar of stones. His lips moved constantly, and though she couldn't hear the words, she felt a chill that went beyond the cool Wisconsin autumn. Father Sullivan and Father Torres decided to visit Daniel again, hoping to assess his state before the exorcism was approved. They arrived at his house in the early evening, the sky bruised with clouds. Daniel was in his workshop, surrounded by shattered clocks. The air smelled of oil and something sharper, like sulfur. Father Sullivan called out, but Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he turned slowly, his eyes gleaming with that same unnatural yellow as the doves. "You're too late," he said, his voice a guttural rasp. "The fire is coming." Father Torres, holding a crucifix, began to pray aloud, but Daniel laughed a hollow, mocking sound that sent a shiver through both priests. Before they could react, Daniel seized a hammer and smashed it into a nearby table, splintering it. The priests retreated, realizing they couldn't confront him alone. Not yet. Back at the rectory, Father Sullivan received word from the archdiocese. Permission for the exorcism had been granted. The bishop, after reviewing the evidence, agreed that Daniel's case showed clear signs of demonic possession, knowledge of an unknown language, aversion to holy objects, and supernatural strength. The exorcism was to be performed as soon as possible, but the bishop cautioned Father Sullivan to proceed with utmost care. Moloch, he noted, was a demon of immense cunning, known for manipulating its victims into acts of destruction. The priest spent the night in prayer, fasting and preparing their hearts. Father Torres, though young, brought a quiet strength, reciting passages from the Psalms to steady himself. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" Evelyn, meanwhile, organized a small prayer group at St. Joseph's. She gathered a handful of parishioners, ordinary folks, a farmer, a school teacher, a retired nurse, and led them in a novena for Daniel's deliverance. They met in the church's small chapel, where a statue of the Virgin Mary stood, her serene face a stark contrast to the fear in their hearts. Evelyn spoke simply but firmly. "We're not just praying for Daniel, we're praying for Baraboo, for all of us." The group's prayers rose like a shield, a counterpoint to the darkness gathering in the tent. One woman, the nurse, shared a story from her childhood. Her grandmother had warned her about the circus grounds, saying the land was tainted by something that never truly left. Evelyn listened, her resolve hardening. She knew the fight wasn't just Daniel's, it was theirs too. As the day of the exorcism approached, the town itself seemed to feel the weight. The air grew colder, though it was only October, and a fog settled over Baraboo, clinging to the streets like a shroud. The doves were seen more often, perching on fences and rooftops, their cooing a constant, unsettling hum. Father Sullivan and Father Torres made one final visit to the tent to prepare the space. They brought holy water, blessed salt, and a large crucifix from the church's altar. Inside, they found fresh signs of disturbance. The cage where Daniel had found the shroud was now overturned, and the ground beneath it was scorched, as if a fire had burned briefly and then gone out. Father Torres traced a cross in the dirt with his finger, whispering a prayer. Father Sullivan looked at the sagging canvas above and felt a presence, not visible but palpable, like a predator waiting in the shadows. In my own work as an exorcist, I've learned that the devil doesn't fight fair. He strikes at the vulnerable, exploits fear, and uses deception to sow chaos. Daniel was a man caught in a web he didn't weave, but the evil in that tent was older than him, older than Baraboo itself. It was a force that had waited decades, perhaps centuries, for the right moment to strike. As Father Sullivan and Father Torres steeled themselves for the exorcism, they knew they were walking into a battle that would demand everything faith, courage, and sacrifice. The circus tent, once a place of laughter and wonder, was now a gateway to something far darker, and the fight to close that gate was about to begin. Father Sullivan and Father Torres spent the days leading up to the exorcism in intense preparation. They met daily at Street, Joseph's church, where they prayed the divine office together, their voices blending in the quiet sanctuary as they sought strength for what lay ahead. Father Sullivan, with his years of pastoral experience, took the lead, guiding Father Torres through the Roman ritual of exorcism. He explained the importance of remaining calm no matter what they faced. The devil will try to unsettle us, he said, his voice steady but grave. He'll use fear, lies, even our own doubts against us. But we have Christ, and that's enough. Father Torres, though less experienced, brought a fiery determination. He spent hours memorizing the prayers, clutching a worn leather Bible that had belonged to his grandfather, a man who'd faced his own trials of faith in a small village in Mexico. The priest decided to consecrate the tent before the exorcism, hoping to weaken Moloch's hold on the space. They arrived at the circus grounds early one morning, just as the sun crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the frost-covered grass. The tent loomed before them, its canvas flaps swaying slightly in the breeze, though the air felt unnaturally still. They carried a small arsenal of sacramentals, holy water from the church's font, blessed salt, a relic of Street, Benedict, and a large crucifix that had hung in Street Joseph's for decades. As they stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply, and the doves, those eerie white birds with yellow eyes, began to coo from the rafters, their sound like a mocking chant. Father Sullivan sprinkled holy water in a wide arc, reciting the Asperges Me. Thou shalt sprinkle me with hyssop, O Lord, and I shall be cleansed. The doves grew agitated, flapping their wings furiously, and a low rumble, like distant thunder, echoed through the tent. Father Torres traced a circle of blessed salt around the spot where they planned to place Daniel's chair during the exorcism. He noticed something unsettling. The scorch marks on the floor, which Clara had pointed out as remnants of the 1920 fire, seemed fresh, as if the fire had burned only hours before. The priests exchanged a glance but pressed on, placing the crucifix on a makeshift altar, a rickety table they'd found in the tent's corner. As they prayed, a sudden gust tore through the tent, though no wind blew outside. The canvas walls shuddered and the doves took flight, circling above like a storm cloud. Father Sullivan raised his voice, invoking the name of Jesus Christ, and the gust died as quickly as it had come. The priest left the tent shaken but resolute, knowing they'd stirred something that didn't want to be disturbed. Back in town, Evelyn's prayer group grew. Word of Daniel's condition had spread, though most dismissed it as mental illness or superstition. The group met nightly in Street, Joseph's chapel, their prayers a steady drumbeat against the growing unease in Baraboo. Evelyn, despite her fear, took on a leadership role, guiding the group through rosaries and litanies. She shared Clara's findings with them, careful not to reveal too much, but enough to convey the urgency. This isn't just about Daniel, she told them, her voice firm. Something old and evil has taken root here, and we're called to stand against it. One member, a farmer named Thomas, brought a small vial of oil, blessed by a visiting bishop years before. He suggested anointing the church doors and windows, a practice his mother had taught him to ward off evil. Evelyn agreed, and the group moved through the church, praying as they dabbed oil on every threshold. Daniel, meanwhile, was descending further into darkness. His neighbors avoided him now, frightened by his erratic behavior. One morning, a delivery boy saw him standing in the street, staring at the tent in the distance, his hands covered in soot. The boy later told his mother he'd heard Daniel whisper, "The fire will rise," though he couldn't be sure. Evelyn, checking on Daniel's house from her porch, noticed the windows were smeared with strange symbols drawn in what looked like ash. She didn't dare approach, but she left a small statue of Street, Michael, on his doorstep, hoping it might offer some protection. That night, the statue was found shattered, its pieces scattered across the yard. Father Sullivan decided to make one final attempt to reach Daniel before the exorcism. He and Father Torres went to his house, armed with their sacramentals and a deep resolve. They found Daniel in his backyard, kneeling before the stone altar he'd built, the shroud draped over it like a grotesque banner. His eyes were closed, and he was chanting in that strange, ancient tongue words that seemed to twist the air around him. Father Sullivan called out, "Daniel, in the name of Jesus Christ, come back to us." Daniel's eyes snapped open, and for a moment they seemed almost human, filled with fear and desperation. But then the yellow glint returned, and he snarled, "You'll burn with the rest." He lunged at Father Torres, knocking him to the ground, but Father Sullivan pulled him back, splashing holy water in Daniel's face. Daniel screamed, a sound that echoed with two voices, one his own, one deeper and guttural. The priests retreated, knowing they couldn't delay any longer. The archdiocese sent a letter outlining the exorcism's protocols. Father Sullivan was to lead, with Father Torres assisting, and they were to follow the Roman ritual precisely. The bishop included a personal note, urging them to trust in God's power and to be wary of Moloch's deception. "This demon thrives on pride and despair," he wrote. "Guard your hearts." The priest chose a date, the night of October 15th, when the moon would be full, casting enough light to work by, but not so bright as to draw attention from curious townsfolk. They decided to bring Daniel to the tent by force if necessary, as his condition made it impossible to reason with him. Evelyn, determined to contribute, spent her days researching Moloch further. She visited the town library, digging through old theological texts and folklore collections. She found references to Moloch in ancient Canaanite myths, always tied to fire and sacrifice, often demanding the lives of the innocent to fuel its power. One chilling passage described a ritual where a shroud soaked in blood was used to bind the demon to a physical place. Evelyn realized the shroud Daniel had found was no accident. It was a deliberate trap left behind by those who'd summoned Moloch decades before. She shared her findings with Father Sullivan, who nodded gravely. "We need to destroy that shroud," he said. "It's the anchor keeping Moloch here." As the day of the exorcism neared, Baraboo seemed to hold its breath. The fog that had settled over the town thickened, curling around the streets like fingers. The doves were everywhere now, perching on power lines, rooftops, even the steeple of St. Joseph's. Their cooing was relentless, a low drone that set people's nerves on edge. One elderly woman, a lifelong resident, told Evelyn she dreamed of a bull-headed figure standing in the tent, its eyes glowing like embers. "It's been here before," she whispered, "and it wants to stay." Father Sullivan and Father Torres made their final preparations. They visited the tent once more, reinforcing the circle of blessed salt and praying over every inch of the space. They found a new disturbance. The crucifix they'd placed on the altar had been knocked to the ground, its wood splintered as if struck by a hammer. Father Torres picked it up, his hands trembling, and whispered, "Lord, give us strength." Father Sullivan placed a hand on his shoulder, his face set with determination. "We're not alone," he said. "Christ is with us." In my work as an exorcist, I've seen how the devil prepares his own battlefield, sowing fear and chaos before the fight even begins. Moloch was doing just that in Baraboo, tightening its grip on Daniel and casting a shadow over the town. Father Sullivan, Father Torres, and Evelyn were ordinary people called to an extraordinary task, armed only with their faith and the tools of the church. As they stood on the brink of the exorcism, they knew they were entering a fight that would demand everything they had. The circus tent, once a place of joy, was now a crucible, and the battle for Daniel's soul was about to ignite. The night of October 15th arrived, shrouded in a thick fog that clung to Baraboo like a second skin. The full moon cast a pale glow, barely piercing the mist, as Father Sullivan and Father Torres made their way to Daniel's house. They knew convincing him to come to the tent would be no easy task. Armed with their sacramentals, a crucifix, holy water, a relic of Street Benedict, and the Roman ritual, they approached with caution. Daniel's house was dark, the windows smeared with ash-drawn symbols that seemed to pulse in the moonlight. Father Sullivan knocked his voice steady as he called out, "Daniel, we're here to help you. In the name of Jesus Christ, open the door." There was no answer, only a low, guttural chuckle from inside that made Father Torres grip his Bible tighter. After several minutes, the door creaked open, revealing Daniel. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and glowing with that eerie yellow hue, like the doves that haunted the tent. He wore tattered clothes, and the shroud was draped over his shoulders like a cloak. "You think you can stop him?" he hissed, his voice layered with something ancient and mocking. Father Sullivan didn't flinch. He raised his crucifix and said, "By the authority of the church and the power of Christ, you will come with us." Daniel lunged, but Father Torres was ready, splashing holy water that made Daniel recoil with a scream that echoed through the quiet street. With the help of 2 trusted parishioners who'd volunteered to assist, they restrained Daniel, binding his wrists with rope blessed by the bishop. It took all their strength to lead him to the tent, his body thrashing as he spat curses in that strange, ancient tongue. The circus tent loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the foggy night. The doves were there, perched in a silent vigil along the roof, their yellow eyes glinting like tiny flames. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with a smell like charred wood and something fouler, almost metallic. The priests had prepared the space earlier, setting up a sturdy wooden chair in the center, surrounded by a ring of blessed salt. They secured Daniel to the chair with more blessed rope, his wrists and ankles tied tightly to prevent him from breaking free. The crucifix stood on the makeshift altar, flanked by candles that flickered despite the still air. Father Sullivan opened the Roman ritual, its pages worn from use, and began the preparatory prayers. "O God, creator and defender of the human race, look upon your servant Daniel, whom you have redeemed by the blood of your Son." As the prayers began, the tent seemed to come alive with malice. The doves outside erupted into a frenzy, their cooing rising to a deafening cacophony, like a choir of the damned. Daniel's body convulsed, his head snapping back as he let out a guttural roar. His skin, pale and clammy, began to ooze a red, blood-like substance that dripped onto the floor, hissing as it hit the salt. Father Torres, standing at Father Sullivan's side, held the relic of Street Benedict and recited the litany of the saints, his voice trembling but resolute. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us. Street Michael, pray for us." Each invocation seemed to provoke Daniel, or the thing within him, further. His eyes rolled back, and he spoke in a voice that was not his own. "You cannot cast me out. This is my temple." Evelyn, though not permitted inside the tent during the exorcism, was nearby, leading her prayer group in a vigil outside Street Joseph's. The group had grown to a dozen, their voices rising in a rosary that carried across the foggy night. Evelyn clutched her rosary beads, her fingers raw from hours of prayer. She'd insisted on being close to the tent, stationed in a small clearing just 50 yards away, where she could see the faint glow of the candles inside. As the priest began the exorcism, she felt a sudden pressure, like an invisible hand pressing against her chest. She whispered the memorare, her voice steady despite the fear. "Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known." Her group joined in, their prayers a lifeline connecting them to the battle unfolding in the tent. Inside, Father Sullivan pressed on, moving to the confrontational phase of the ritual. He held the crucifix aloft and commanded, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I order you, Moloch, to name yourself and depart from this man." Daniel's body arched violently, the ropes creaking under the strain. The voice that answered was deep, resonant, and filled with contempt. "I am Moloch, Lord of fire and sacrifice. This soul is mine, and you will burn for your insolence." The temperature in the tent plummeted, and a small flame sparked to life near the altar, licking at the wooden table without any apparent source. Father Torres, his face pale, sprinkled holy water toward the flame, which hissed but didn't extinguish. The doves outside grew louder, their wings beating against the canvas like a storm. Father Sullivan, undeterred, continued the prayers, his voice rising above the chaos. By the power of Christ, I bind you, unclean spirit, and cast you into the abyss. Daniel's body shook, his head thrashing as if trying to tear itself free. The red substance oozing from his skin began to pool on the floor, forming shapes that looked disturbingly like the bullhead symbols he'd carved in his workshop. Father Torres, though shaken, held his ground, reciting Psalm 23, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." The words seemed to anchor him, giving him the strength to stand firm as the tent itself seemed to groan, the canvas walls rippling as if pushed by an unseen force. Outside, Evelyn's prayer group faced their own trial. As they reached the third decade of the Rosary, a sudden wind tore through the clearing, strong enough to knock over a folding chair. Evelyn felt a sharp pain in her wrist, as if something had struck her, and she gasped, clutching her arm. The others rushed to her side, but she waved them off, insisting they continue praying. "Don't stop," she said, her voice hoarse. "Daniel needs us." The group pressed on, their voices trembling but unbroken, as the fog around them thickened, carrying the faint sound of the dove's relentless cooing. Back in the tent, the exorcism reached a critical point. Daniel, or Moloch, began to speak in a rapid, mocking tone, taunting the priests with secrets from their pasts. To Father Sullivan, it whispered of a moment of doubt he'd felt during his seminary years, a night when he'd questioned his calling. To Father Torres, it spoke of a childhood fear, a memory of his grandfather's death that he'd buried deep. The demon's words were like knives, cutting at their resolve, but both priests clung to their faith. Father Sullivan raised the crucifix higher, his voice booming, "You have no power here, Moloch. By the blood of Christ, you are defeated." The flame near the altar flared, casting wild shadows, and Daniel let out a scream that seemed to shake the very ground. In my work as an exorcist, I've seen how the devil uses every trick to break those who oppose him. Moloch was no different, wielding fear and deception like weapons. But Father Sullivan and Father Torres, fortified by their preparation and the prayers of Evelyn's group, stood as beacons of light in that darkened tent. The battle was far from over, and the cost would be higher than any of them imagined. But in that moment, they were united in their purpose: to free Daniel and banish the evil that had taken root in Baraboo. The circus tent, a place of faded dreams, had become a crucible of faith, and the fight was only beginning to burn. Inside the tent, the atmosphere was suffocating. The candles on the makeshift altar cast long, wavering shadows, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burning, though no source was clear. Daniel's body strained against the ropes, his muscles bulging unnaturally as he thrashed, his head snapping from side to side. The red, blood-like substance oozing from his skin had formed a pool beneath the chair, its surface rippling with shapes that seemed to writhe like living things. Father Sullivan, his face etched with determination, held the crucifix aloft, his voice steady as he recited the exorcism prayers. "I adjure you, ancient serpent, by the judge of the living and the dead, to depart from this servant of God." Each word seemed to strike like a hammer, provoking a violent reaction from Daniel or the entity within him. Moloch's voice, deep and resonant, filled the tent, drowning out the dove's relentless cooing. "You are weak," it taunted, its words dripping with contempt. "This man belongs to me, and your prayers are dust." It spoke of Daniel's loneliness, his unspoken desire to leave a mark on the world, twisting his pain into a weapon. "He offered himself to me," the demon hissed, "when he touched my shroud." Father Torres, clutching the relic of street, Benedict, felt a surge of fear but pushed it down, reciting the Salve Regina in a clear, unwavering voice. "Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy." His words were a lifeline, anchoring him against the demon's onslaught. Then, without warning, Daniel's body went rigid, and the ropes binding him snapped as if cut by an invisible blade. He rose from the chair, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet pulled by unseen strings. The priests froze, their breath catching as Daniel turned and staggered deeper into the tent, toward a shadowed corner where the canvas sagged heavily. Father Sullivan, recognizing the danger, shouted, "In the name of Christ, stop!" But Daniel didn't falter. The doves outside erupted into a frenzy, their wings beating against the tent like a thunderstorm, and the small flame near the altar flared, casting a red glow across the scene. Father Torres, his heart pounding, followed Father Sullivan as they pursued Daniel. They found him clawing at the dirt floor, uncovering a hidden trapdoor they hadn't noticed in their earlier preparations. The trapdoor, made of weathered wood, was carved with the same bullhead symbols Daniel had etched in his workshop. He pried it open with unnatural strength, revealing a shallow pit beneath where a crude stone altar lay, stained with dark, ancient marks. The air from the pit was cold, carrying a stench like burnt flesh, and the priests felt a wave of nausea. Daniel stood over the altar, his body trembling, and raised the shroud, which he clutched throughout the ordeal. "This is his temple," he roared, his voice a chilling blend of his own and Moloch's. Father Sullivan acted quickly, splashing holy water into the pit and reciting the prayer of exorcism with renewed force. "Depart, unclean spirit, and give place to the Holy Spirit." The water hissed as it struck the altar, and Daniel screamed, dropping to his knees. But Moloch wasn't done. The demon's voice boomed, "You cannot destroy what has been built through centuries." It spoke of a history stretching back to the 1800s, when a possessed performer had first brought Moloch's influence to Baraboo, only to be driven out by a priest's intervention. "This tent is mine," it declared, "and I will burn it all before I leave." Aviwa. Outside, Evelyn's prayer group felt the battle's intensity. The fog around the clearing thickened, and the air grew heavy, as if pressing down on them. Evelyn's wrist throbbed, the pain sharp and unrelenting, but she refused to stop praying. She led the group in the chaplet of divine mercy, her voice cutting through the night. "For the sake of his sorrowful passion, have mercy on us and on the whole world." The others followed, their voices trembling but resolute. One member, the retired nurse, clutched a small medal of street. Joseph, her hands shaking as she whispered, "Protect them, please." Suddenly a sharp crack echoed from the tent, like wood splitting, and the group gasped, their prayers faltering for a moment before Evelyn urged them on. Inside, the situation grew dire. The flame near the altar spread, licking at the canvas walls, though it burned without consuming them, an unnatural fire that seemed to feed on the demon's presence. Daniel, still kneeling by the hidden altar, began to chant in that ancient Akkadian tongue, his words rhythmic and hypnotic. Father Torres, his face pale but determined, stepped forward, holding the crucifix from the altar. "Moloch, you have no power here," he shouted, his voice breaking through the chant. He pressed the crucifix against Daniel's forehead, and the man's body convulsed, his scream echoing with two voices, one human, one demonic. Father Sullivan, seeing the fire's unnatural spread, realized the shroud was the key. "We need to destroy it," he said to Father Torres, his voice urgent. But before they could act, Daniel or Moloch lunged, knocking Father Torres to the ground. The young priest hit the dirt hard, the crucifix falling from his hand. Daniel grabbed the shroud and held it aloft, his eyes blazing with that yellow glow. "The fire will rise," he roared, and the flames around the altar surged, forming a ring that trapped the priest. Father Sullivan, coughing through the smoke, pulled Father Torres to his feet and continued the prayers, his voice unwavering. "By the power of the Holy Trinity, I command you to release this man." Evelyn, outside, felt a sudden urge to act. Despite the pain in her wrist, she left the prayer group and approached the tent, her rosary clutched tightly. She could see the glow of flames through the canvas and hear Daniel's unearthly screams. Ignoring the protests of her companions, she slipped inside, staying near the entrance to avoid interfering with the priests. The sight before her was terrifying. Daniel standing over a hidden altar, the shroud in his hands, surrounded by flames that seemed to dance to his words. Father Sullivan and Father Torres were struggling to maintain control, their faces lit by the eerie light. Evelyn, driven by a courage born of faith, began to pray aloud, her voice joining the priest's. Hail Mary, full of grace. Her presence seemed to shift something. Daniel's head snapped toward her, and Moloch's voice snarled, "You dare enter my sanctuary?" The flames flared, and a force like a gust of wind pushed Evelyn back, slamming her against the tent's canvas wall. Her wrist snapped under the impact, the pain blinding, but she didn't stop praying. She crawled forward, her eyes fixed on the shroud. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered, and with a surge of resolve, she lunged for the shroud, tearing it from Daniel's grasp. The demon roared and the flames surged higher, but Evelyn, clutching the cloth, stumbled toward the altar's fire. In my work as an exorcist, I've seen moments where ordinary people become instruments of God's grace, their courage defying the darkness. Evelyn's act was one such moment, a spark of light in a place consumed by shadow. The battle in the tent was reaching its climax, and the cost was mounting. Father Sullivan and Father Torres, battered but unyielding, pressed on, knowing that the shroud's destruction could break Moloch's hold. But the demon was not finished, and the night would demand a sacrifice none of them could have foreseen. The circus tent, a place of forgotten dreams, was now a furnace of faith and fire, and the outcome hung in the balance. The tent was a cauldron of chaos. The flames that had sparked near the hidden altar now formed a blazing ring, their heat intense yet strangely contained, as if obeying the will of the entity within Daniel. The canvas walls trembled, the doves outside beating their wings in a frenzied rhythm that matched the pounding hearts of those inside. Evelyn, clutching the shroud with her uninjured hand, staggered toward the fire, her face set with a determination born of faith. Her wrists throbbed, the pain a constant reminder of the demon's power, but she pressed forward, whispering the prayer to street. "Michael, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil." Her voice, though soft, cut through the cacophony, a beacon in the darkness. Father Sullivan, his face streaked with sweat and soot, saw Evelyn's move and understood her intent. "The shroud!" he shouted to Father Torres, who was scrambling to his feet after being knocked down. "It's the anchor, burn it." The young priest nodded, his eyes wide but resolute, and grabbed a vial of holy water, splashing it toward Daniel to keep him at bay. Daniel or Moloch roared, his body lurching forward as if to reclaim the shroud. His hands clawed at the air, and his voice, a terrifying blend of human and demonic, bellowed, "You will not destroy my covenant." The flames surged, licking at the wooden chair where Daniel had been bound, and the air grew thick with smoke that stung the priest's eyes. Evelyn, with a strength that seemed to come from beyond herself, reached the altar's fire and thrust the shroud into the flames. The cloth caught instantly, its edges curling as the red inscription of Moloch blackened and disintegrated. A piercing scream erupted from Daniel, a sound so raw and otherworldly that it seemed to tear at the fabric of reality. The doves outside fell silent, their wings stilling, and for a moment the tent was filled with an eerie quiet broken only by the crackle of the burning shroud. Father Sullivan seized the moment, raising the crucifix and chanting, "By the power of Jesus Christ, I command you, Moloch, to leave this man and return to the abyss." His voice echoed with authority, bolstered by years of faith and the prayers of those outside. But Moloch was not so easily defeated. The demon's voice, now strained, lashed out, "You think this ends me? I am eternal." Daniel's body convulsed, his limbs twisting at unnatural angles, and the flames around the altar flared higher, catching the edge of Father Torres' cassock. The young priest yelped, batting at the fire, but it spread quickly, climbing up his sleeve like a living thing. Father Sullivan rushed to his side, tearing off his own stole to smother the flames, but the heat was relentless, searing Father Torres' arm and chest. The pain was excruciating, yet Father Torres gritted his teeth and continued praying, his voice hoarse, "Lord, deliver us from evil." Evelyn, still clutching her rosary, crawled away from the altar, her broken wrists sending waves of agony through her body. She collapsed near the tent's entrance, her breath ragged, but she refused to leave. "Keep going," she gasped, her eyes fixed on the priests. The shroud was now a pile of ash, its destruction weakening Moloch's hold, but the demon fought back with desperate fury. Daniel's body rose, not standing but floating, his feet dangling inches above the ground. His eyes, still glowing yellow, locked onto Father Sullivan, and the demon spoke in a chilling whisper, "You will pay for this, priest. Baraboo will burn." Entertain. Father Sullivan, undaunted, pressed forward with the exorcism, his voice rising above the crackling flames and Daniel's unearthly moans. He recited the rite of exorcism's final commands, invoking the names of the Trinity, the Virgin Mary, and all the saints. Each word seemed to strike Daniel like a physical blow, his body jerking as if caught in a storm. Father Torres, despite his burns, joined in, holding the relic of street Benedict and praying through clenched teeth. The doves, which had resumed their cooing, began to scatter, their forms dissolving into the fog outside as if fleeing the scene. The tent's canvas walls shook violently, and the ground beneath the altar cracked, sending up a cloud of dust and ash. Outside, Evelyn's prayer group sensed the shift. The fog seemed to lift slightly, and the oppressive weight in the air eased, though the night remained heavy with tension. The group, now huddled closer together, continued their rosary, their voices growing stronger as they reached the 5th decade. The farmer Thomas raised his blessed oil and anointed the ground, praying for protection over the priests and Daniel. The retired nurse, her hands trembling, led a spontaneous hymn, Amazing Grace, her voice cracking but resolute. Their faith was a shield, bolstering the efforts inside the tent. Back in the tent, the climax arrived. As the shroud's ashes scattered, Daniel's body collapsed to the ground, his levitation ending abruptly. He lay still, his breathing shallow, his eyes closed. The flames around the altar began to die, shrinking to embers, and the air grew less oppressive. Father Sullivan, exhausted but unwavering, sprinkled holy water over Daniel, reciting the final prayers of deliverance. May the Lord rebuke you, Satan, and free this soul from your grasp. The demon's voice was gone, replaced by Daniel's own faint moans, a sign that Moloch's hold was weakening. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Father Torres, his burns severe, collapsed beside the altar, his cassock charred and his skin blistered. Father Sullivan knelt beside him, tearing strips from his own cassock to wrap the wounds, but the damage was extensive. "Stay with me, Miguel," he whispered, his voice breaking. Evelyn, dragging herself to her feet, stumbled to the priest, her broken wrist dangling uselessly. She called out to the prayer group, and 2 members rushed to help, carrying Father Torres out of the tent and into the night, where they drove him to the nearest hospital, 30 miles away in Madison. Daniel remained unconscious, his body limp on the dirt floor. Father Sullivan, his strength nearly spent, continued praying over him, ensuring the demon's departure. The tent was quiet now, the doves gone, the flames extinguished. Evelyn, despite her pain, knelt beside Daniel, her rosary pressed against his chest, her prayers a soft murmur. The air felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted, but the scars of the battle were evident in the charred altar, the cracked ground, and the broken bodies of those who had fought. In my work as an exorcist, I've seen how the devil exacts a price, even in defeat. Moloch's hold on Daniel was broken, but the cost was staggering. Father Torres, carried to the hospital, would not survive the night, his burns too severe. Evelyn's wrist would never heal properly, a permanent reminder of her courage. And Daniel, though freed, lay in a state of collapse, his mind and body ravaged by the ordeal. The circus tent, once a place of spectacle, had become a battlefield, and though the light of faith had prevailed, the shadows of that night would linger, a testament to the price of standing against evil. The tent, once a vortex of chaos, fell silent as the last embers of the unnatural fire died out. The air, heavy with the stench of smoke and something fouler, began to clear, and the oppressive weight that had gripped the space lifted like a storm passing. Father Sullivan knelt beside Daniel, his hands trembling from exhaustion as he continued to pray, his voice hoarse but steady. "Lord, protect your servant and restore him to your light." Daniel's breathing was shallow, his face pale and streaked with the red, blood-like substance that had oozed during the exorcism. His eyes, once glowing with that eerie yellow, were closed. And for the first time in weeks, he seemed at peace, though his body bore the marks of the ordeal, bruises, cuts, and a frailty that spoke of a soul pushed to its limits. Evelyn, her wrist throbbing with pain, remained at Daniel's side, her rosary still pressed against his chest. Her prayer group, stationed just outside, had felt the shift in the air and rushed to the tent's entrance, their faces a mix of relief and fear. The farmer Thomas helped Evelyn to her feet, his rough hands gentle as he supported her. The retired nurse, tears streaming down her face, began a hymn, "Holy God, we praise thy name," and the group joined in, their voices carrying into the foggy night. The doves, those unsettling white birds that had haunted the tent, were gone, their absence a stark contrast to the relentless cooing that had plagued Baraboo for weeks. The fog itself seemed to thin, the moonlight breaking through to cast a soft glow over the scene. Father Sullivan, his strength nearly spent, looked around the tent, taking stock of the devastation. The hidden altar, uncovered by Daniel during the exorcism, was cracked and scorched, its stone surface littered with ash from the burned shroud. The wooden chair where Daniel had been bound was charred, its ropes frayed and useless. The crucifix, knocked over earlier, lay in the dirt, its wood splintered but intact. Father Sullivan retrieved it, holding it close as he whispered a prayer of thanksgiving. He knew the battle had been won, but the cost weighed heavily on his heart. Father Torres, his young assistant, was fighting for his life in a hospital 30 miles away, and Evelyn's injury was a permanent reminder of her bravery. Word came from Madison in the early hours of the morning. Father Torres had succumbed to his burns. The news struck Father Sullivan like a physical blow. He sat in the rectory staring at the crucifix on the wall, his hands clasped tightly. Father Torres had been a beacon of hope, a young priest whose faith had burned bright even in the face of Moloch's fury. His sacrifice was a stark reminder of the stakes in spiritual warfare, where victory often comes at a price. Father Sullivan arranged a memorial mass at St. Joseph's, where the community gathered to honor Father Torres' courage. The church was filled with townsfolk, many of whom had dismissed the stories of Daniel's possession as superstition, but now felt the weight of something profound. Daniel was taken to the same hospital in Madison, where he remained in a coma for several days. When he awoke, he was a shadow of the man he'd been. His memory of his life as a watchmaker was gone, as if Moloch had stripped away a piece of his soul. He could no longer repair clocks, his hands trembling too much to handle the delicate gears. Doctors found no physical cause for his condition, but Father Sullivan knew it was the toll of possession, a wound that went beyond the body. Daniel moved to a care facility in a nearby town, where he lived quietly, attended by nurses and visited by Evelyn, who brought him a small cross to keep by his bedside. He spoke little, but his eyes, now clear of that yellow glow, held a quiet gratitude. Evelyn's wrist never healed properly. She wore a brace for the rest of her life, a constant reminder of the night she'd faced Moloch. Yet she bore it with grace, returning to her prayer group and leading them with renewed fervor. She became a pillar at St. Joseph's, organizing rosary circles and speaking quietly about the power of faith. She never spoke of the exorcism publicly, respecting Father Sullivan's request for discretion, but she shared enough with her group to inspire them to pray for protection over Baraboo. "We fought something real," she told them, her voice steady, "and we won because we trusted in God." The circus tent did not survive the winter. The town council, spurred by whispers of the night's events, voted to demolish it. Bulldozers arrived in November, tearing down the sagging canvas and clearing the land. Father Sullivan oversaw a blessing of the site, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers of purification from the Roman ritual. He buried a medal of St. Benedict in the soil, a final act to seal the ground against any lingering influence. The doves never returned, and the strange fog that had gripped Baraboo lifted, leaving the town to its quiet rhythms. But the memory of that night lingered, woven into the fabric of the community. Stories began to circulate, as they always do in small towns. Some spoke of hearing faint cooing in the fields at night, though no doves were seen. Others claimed to see a shadow with the shape of a bull's head in the mist, fleeting but unmistakable. One young boy, playing near the old circus grounds, found a small piece of scorched cloth buried in the dirt, but his mother, spooked by the rumors, threw it into a fire. Father Sullivan, who remained at St. Joseph's, became a quieter man, his sermons more reflective. He carried a small crucifix everywhere, a habit born of that night, and he spoke often of the need for vigilance. Evil doesn't sleep, he told his congregation, but neither does God's grace. And fruit. In the years that followed, Baraboo returned to its ordinary life, but the story of the exorcism became a quiet legend, passed down in hushed tones. Some dismissed it as folklore, but those who'd been part of Evelyn's prayer group knew better. They continued their vigils, praying for the town and for those who might still be vulnerable to the forces that had once stirred in the tent. Clara, the historian, recovered from her injury and wrote a book about Baraboo's circus history, carefully omitting the darkest details. She dedicated it to Father Torres, calling him a man of courage who gave all for others. In my work as an exorcist, I've seen how battles like this leave marks, not just on the individuals involved, but on entire communities. Moloch, with its ancient roots in the Old Testament, is a demon of sacrifice, preying on human desires for immortality and power. It chose Daniel because of his loneliness, his quiet yearning to be remembered, but it underestimated the faith of those around him. Father Sullivan, Evelyn, Father Torres, and the prayer group stood as warriors, armed not with weapons, but with prayer, sacrifice, and trust in God. Their victory was hard won, but it came at a cost that none could forget. This story reminds us that evil is real, persistent, and cunning, always seeking a foothold. But it also shows us that faith is stronger, that the light of Christ can pierce even the deepest darkness. As I reflect on Baraboo, I think of Father Torres' sacrifice, of Evelyn's courage, of Father Sullivan's resolve. They faced Moloch and prevailed, not because they were extraordinary, but because they trusted in the one who island. Let this be a call to all of us to pray, to stand firm, and to remember that no matter how fierce the darkness, the grace of God is fiercer still.